Hello, and welcome to the Cato Institute's forum with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We'll be talking about their 2025 College Free Speech Rankings. I am Eric Smith. I am a research fellow in politics and society here at the Cato Institute and a former professor of rhetoric. Perhaps by the end of this event, you'll realize why I had to resign from academia, but that is not the main point of this event. The main point is the 2025 College Free Speech Rankings. I have here three members from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, henceforth called FIRE. We have here Angela Erickson, Vice President of Research at FIRE. We have Laura Beltz, Director of Policy Reform for FIRE. And last but not least, we have Sean Stevens, Chief Research Advisor for FIRE. Before we get into the conversation, I want to let people know that we'll be taking questions both online and in person. For those online, please submit your questions directly on the event webpage on Facebook, YouTube, or everybody's favorite social media platform, X, using the hashtag CatoEvents label. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we talk about FIRE's free speech rankings, I want to talk about FIRE itself. So what is FIRE, what is its mission, and what do you guys do?
I can jump in on that. So FIRE is a nonpartisan nonprofit that defends the First Amendment. And so we used to be called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. You might have heard us by that name when we focus solely on college students and faculty members. That's still a huge part of our work, but now we defend free speech rights of all Americans.
Okay. Anything else?
I'll add on. So FIRE is in its 25th year this year, and so we've been doing this for a long time. And as Laura said, we started with campus, so we've got 25 years worth of trying to fight for free speech on campus.
All right, fantastic. And campus seems to be the ground zero of free speech issues these days, for better or for worse. No, for worse, it seems. But I will ask you this question. What is the state of free speech on America's college campuses?
Where should we start?
Well, it's been an interesting year. Sure, we expanded off campus, and then all of our work this past year has largely been on campus. Yeah. Not all of it, but a lot of it. I think it's in a very interesting place. We have data points now in some of our research that suggest liberal and progressive students are actually very concerned about the security of free speech on campus. I think this is a result of what's happened the past year and how the protests over Israel-Palestine have been handled.
Yes.
Administrators admittedly have dealt with a mix of protected and unprotected speech, and some have reacted well and some have overreacted. Okay. But I think that also presents an opportunity for people who are speech advocates, because you finally have this large constituency on campus concerned about the issue and maybe not viewing it as a right-wing tool.
Right. There's this idea that free speech is a virtue of the right, and a vice to the left. But there are a lot of people on the left who are also concerned about this. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. So another good thing about your rankings is that you actually show the reality of the situation. This is a bipartisan issue and not a partisan issue. Wonderful, fantastic. So methodology, how you went about doing this, how you interviewed so many people, almost 60,000 students, is that right?
Yeah, this year we surveyed almost 60,000 students, just short of 59. It's a little like 58, 900 something. This is our survey partner, College Pulse, does a great job not only recruiting students. They have a panel of over 850,000 undergraduates. But the key for us is they can tell us what campus they're on. We can't rank the schools if we don't know where the responses are coming from. And right now, they're really like the only place that can do that in a way that we're sure that these students are coming from Harvard and Vanderbilt and Yale and UC Berkeley, et cetera. With a YouGov or another survey outlet, you're basically at the mercy of asking the students or hoping that the survey company has some other way of validating their enrollment.
Yeah, so we looked at 260 some odd schools with this survey, asking about a various variety of student attitudes towards whether or not they self-censor how they feel about the administration, whether it would protect their free speech rights or speakers' rights, whether or not speakers on the left or right should be allowed to speak on campus, sort of the extreme, more offensive types of speakers. And so we're doing, what are the other elements of this?
We ask what political topics are difficult to have an open and honest conversation about, and what kinds of protests are acceptable.
Right.
Those are like illiberal forms of protest, so.
Yeah. And then we have two other components to it. One is the policy ratings that Laura does.
Right, and so we take a look at all the regulations on student expression at a school, and we rate the extent to which they restrict protected speech. So if it's an IT policy that bans making threats using computers or the university Wi-Fi, we look, does that standard for a threat align with the Supreme Court standard for what a true threat is? Or if it's a protest policy, we see, all right, they're setting forth regulations on the time, place, and manner of speech. Would that be a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction upheld by a court? And so we take a look at all of that, and we rate those policies on this sort of traffic light-based scale, where red light policies are ones that clearly and substantially restrict free speech. Yellow light policies are ones that are more vague or are regulating a more narrow area of the campus, like only in the residence halls. And then green light policies are ones that do not seriously imperil free speech. So we take that rating, and that's one of the components that feeds into the ranking score.
So we end up with student attitudes, how the students feel about what the environment is like on campus. We've got what the school's rules on the books say, and then we also have what's actually happening on campus. So we have behavioral metrics as well.
Right, because even when the policies look great on paper and are earning that green light rating from FIRE, that doesn't mean that administrators are actually applying those policies well. Sometimes our casework team finds that they're not even invoking a policy when they're punishing a student. They are just ad hoc punishing them. So it's important to both hit the element of, all right, do students have those protections on the books? Can they fall back on that if their rights are violated? But also, what is the school actually doing in practice?
Okay. How has the past year been different regarding the free speech rankings? Now, obviously, there have been some things happening the last year or so that haven't been normal or expected as far as I'm concerned, but it had to be something you had to take notice of and dive into. I'm speaking about October 7th and everything that happened after October 7th and the encampments going on college campuses after October 7th. I believe you had to reopen the rankings to a degree?
So we reopened the surveying. So we run the survey January through June, and so some of the schools we'd stopped collecting in spring, and so we reopened it after the encampments had started in some of those schools.
Yeah, there was a decision, like a research-based decision we made with our survey partner. So we have a lot of pre-post data in this year's rankings that we were able to look at, and we found strong validation for a lot of our survey questions. On campuses where students were arrested, their perceptions of the administration's support and likelihood of defending free speech plummeted. The two schools that plummeted to the bottom on that metric are Barnard and Columbia. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's necessarily that surprising. Yeah. And other schools that were in the news for controversial responses to the encampments also wound up in the bottom 10. So this is Indiana, University of Texas at Austin. This is University of Southern California, Harvard, UPenn, places like that.
Okay, let's talk about the colleges that performed well and the ones that did not perform well. I've noticed that of the top 10, I think only one college is a private college, and of the bottom 10, only 2 are public?
Yeah, the 2 I just mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. So what's that about?
So let's talk about who's at top.
So the top is University of Virginia was a top-ranked school this year, followed by Michigan Tech, who was the top-ranked school last year, Florida State, who's been in the top 5 every year except for one, and the one year they weren't. They were ranked like 14th or 15th, so they seem to be a fairly consistently good performer. We have Eastern Carolina, Eastern Kentucky, and then I actually think the school that deserves the shout out is the small private school, Claremont McKenna, because if you actually look at their survey metrics, they do really well on them. And so this is a school where the student body is 4 to 5 to 1 in terms of a ratio of liberal to conservative students. Most of these other schools in the top 10 have much smaller ratios, so they're more ideologically diverse. And this is a school with about 2,000 students enrolled, and pretty much all the students say they feel comfortable expressing their views in class, and they can discuss difficult political topics. I think they deserve a pretty nice shout out for what they're doing, and they're a school to investigate to figure out how other schools can do better.
So taking it back to what's the difference? So we labeled a lot of those schools. We'll notice a lot of the schools at the top are public schools. They're bound by the First Amendment. Schools at the bottom are private schools. They're not bound.
Yeah, and when you take a look at our ratings of policies, it's the same sort of trend. And again, it makes sense. Public schools are bound by the First Amendment, so they're more likely to have policies that are in compliance with First Amendment standards, whereas private schools often relish the idea that they can make those ad hoc decisions and have policies that allow them to do so. I mean, I've heard administrators say things like, we have this conduct code that says I can ban anything unbecoming of students of our institution. It's incredibly vague. It gives them license to take action against any speech they find disfavored, and they kind of like having that ability, whereas you can't get away with that at a public school.
This is good news to have, I think. So that raises the question of who is this survey for? Who's your target audience here? Parents, students, administrators, and faculty?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a wide variety, I'd say. There's certainly parents and students so that they have information to make an informed decision about where they might want to go, especially if they care about free expression, freedom of speech. It's also for reporters, media people, certainly for administrators, maybe more as a stick to kind of point out to them that things aren't doing so well. And we've had some successes with schools being upset about where they rank, and then working mainly with Laura and her team to reform their policies. And then we also see downstream improvement in the survey responses there.
All right. I did want to ask that question. Have
Yeah.
schools reached out to you? The top schools, the bottom schools, what have they said?
Yeah, they have, and it's been encouraging that they are aware there is a problem here. There isn't an open environment for free speech. I mean, cynically, you might say, oh, they just want to have a higher ranking, but from conversations I've had with administrators, they do want to improve the environment. They know that that's what a college or a university should be for. And so one example of that, University of South Carolina reached out to FIRE affirmatively on their own and said, we see this poor ranking, what can we do to improve this? And so we worked directly with the administration to revise their policies, but they didn't stop there. They also adopted a free speech policy statement, and they shared that with students, shared that they had made these revisions publicly with their students. And we've seen that reflected, as Sean said, in the survey results later, that it wasn't just that their ranking went up because of the score from the rating improvement, but really it was reflected in the answers.
Their score went up certainly because they went from yellow to green light, but that was actually only a third of the point increase that they got. The other 2/3 came from improved performance on the survey components. And then I'll add that they passed a big test in the fall when Uncensored America, a student group on campus, invited Gavin McGinnis and Milo Yiannopoulos to host a roast of Kamala Harris on campus. So this was approved by, not approved, this was opposed by state senators, the NAACP, students, student organizations, alumni. There was a change.org petition, and the university said, no, we're not canceling this event. The event went on without a hitch. So they're going to get a bonus for that in the rankings next year.
And not only did they say, no, we're not canceling it, what I thought was a great response was that they said, because of our commitment to freedom of expression, and they referenced the policies that they have adopted. And so what a great approach as far as explaining that to students, the actual why behind our decision, and grounding that in free speech principles.
And that's why they'll get a bonus in the rankings, because it wasn't just that they allowed the event to occur and it went off without a hitch. It's that they very publicly endorsed the First Amendment and made it very clear to their students where they stand.
Do these schools do most of them anyway, have their own statements? I know private colleges are not beholden to the First Amendment, but they may have their own statements, a la the Chicago Statement or something like that?
Right. The vast majority of private schools make commitments to freedom of expression that sound just like the First Amendment. They put them in the official student documents like the student handbook. And so when they've made that sort of commitment, officially in writing, they need to live up to that commitment. Students are making decisions to enroll based on what they see from the university. So that's why FIRE considers that, if you've made that commitment, you then need to follow through with it.
Okay. Were you able to discern from your research why certain schools were so bad with this free speech thing in the first place? I made the, erroneous assumption that administrations knew what they were doing. I guess not. If they're talking to you and saying, yeah, we want to improve, that strongly implies that they don't know how to improve. But is that the case? Is it just I want to say incompetence. I really don't want to say that. But incompetence?
I mean, these are not easy questions. So I can understand why not every administrator has been trained on the First Amendment, and that's why I think that education on free speech principles and on the First Amendment is so important for administrators and also students. If you aren't training staff who are applying policies on how to do so, then you have these sorts of incidents that feed into our rankings where we have rights violations.
I'd also say, I think in our interactions, we've found that the high-level administrators, people like the provost, the chancellor, the vice chancellor, the president, they clearly care about expression and promoting free speech for the most part. And in these controversies that can impact the rankings, oftentimes you're seeing mid-level, they're not the top-level administrators, but they're the ones enacting the policies, and they kind of enact them in a way where it's like a Groucho Marx thing. It's like, well, if you don't like my principles, I have others, and it depending on the incident, it'll depend on how they sort it out.
Some of it is what our President Greg Lukianoff calls the growth of safetyism in higher ed, trying to protect students from things that are uncomfortable. And so there's this case that we had, this woman, Kat, who was at Northern Michigan University, and she was having scary suicidal thoughts. And so she went and talked to a counselor, and they told her that she couldn't go and talk to any friends about her feelings of self-harm. She couldn't go and rely on a friend to talk about something really important, painful going on inside of her. And that is because they were afraid that it would, spread on campus, and that type of stuff, where it's just the ability to talk to a friend freely and free expression that they're trying to protect these adults from on campus.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's that they haven't been trained on the First Amendment, but then other times it is a willful decision not to apply the First Amendment. And I mean, I have heard from folks, attorneys general, who advise university presidents who say, I have told my university president we can't do this, it will violate the First Amendment. And they say, sure, but I've got donors on the phone, and I'm getting pressure from other sources, and we need to make this decision.
Okay, so donors affect decisions. How about the students? How much of this is student-driven?
Yeah, I mean, that's another source of pressure. When we were talking about the University of South Carolina issue, there were certainly students asking for that event to be canceled. And sometimes students are even the ones who are applying policies. Student government, they are often imbued with the powers to decide things like what groups get funding, what events are able to take place. Resident assistants at universities often are the ones who are taking down a poster off of a dorm wall because it's offensive. And so, again, there needs to be training on this at every level.
And we actually promote having freshman orientation on the First Amendment. What is free speech? What is not free speech? What is, what is a liberal protest? What is not protected? So that they know those boundaries.
And we keep mentioning these controversies. We maintain this campus deplatforming database. We have a Scholars Under Fire database, and we have a soon-to-be-released Students Under Fire database. These all factor into the rankings in ways, and so I wanted to bring up, because Laura brought up student government kind of maybe putting up obstacles for expression on campus. One of the reasons Michigan Tech ranks very highly is student government tried to ban a speaker from coming to campus. They wouldn't approve the student group who applied to bring the speaker to campus. They wouldn't approve the request, and the administration stepped in and said, you can't do that.
Okay, so a school can be ranked highly, but the students can be predominantly against free speech rights.
There's pockets of that like that, sure, I think, yeah. Like the administration stepped in and basically did the right thing.
Okay.
And so we gave them marks for that. And Michigan Tech does well on a number of the survey components, but then on some of them, they're actually not as great on.
A lot of schools are becoming a kind of the customer's always right institution, right? Customers being students. Is that a lot of this motivation, wanting students to stay, wanting to retain students so we do what they want, even if it's against free speech rights or the school's own policies?
I think that's how they got into trouble this last year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
To the
I think it was
greater
very,
degree,
and then
right?
they were also trying to meet the demands of donors and alumni, maybe complaining from the other end of the expression spectrum.
One of the policies that promote is institutional neutrality. This is where a university's mission is to educate, and so they shouldn't be taking positions on, say, Israel-Palestine. And so because a lot of schools don't have institutional neutrality position, historically, and they might take sides on specific political or social issues. And so this last year, when October 7th occurred, they couldn't stand by a principle of we are an education institution, all ideas are welcome here, we're not taking a stance.
Okay. I just want to stop and let all this sink in right now. And I'm also happy that I made the right decision in stepping away from academia for some time. Maybe I'll go back one of these days when the free speech situation isn't so volatile. But right now it is. And frankly, I think this is a bigger issue than people are letting on because it also has a paralinguistic element to it. I was once told that I didn't know the damage my body was doing to vulnerable populations because I was saying things that black people are not supposed to say, right? So there's a body language situation going on here as well. I don't know if you measure body language free speech, but perhaps that's something for the future.
I will highlight, Eric. We haven't talked actually a lot about faculty. We've mostly been talking about students on campus and interacting with administrators, but Sean mentioned that we have a database of scholars under fire, and we have a forthcoming faculty survey that'll be coming out next month to stay tuned for.
Okay. Has there been a correlation between schools that are labeled liberal arts colleges and schools that are not? Are the small liberal arts colleges the ones that are really, guilty of this free speech suppression, besides Claremont and McKenna?
So I think that goes back to one of your earlier questions about the top 10, bottom 10, et cetera. If you look closely, excluding Claremont McKenna, you've got a lot of medium to large size state schools, right? And then in the bottom, you've got a number of small liberal arts colleges and then medium-sized elite institutions like a Harvard and UPenn, whose undergrad population isn't necessarily that high,
right,
compared to a place like UVA or Florida State. I think that has a lot to do with why these schools are where they are. When you have a larger population, it's far more likely that you can find people that you feel comfortable talking to. And so they maybe are a little siloed on these larger campuses in groups that they feel comfortable with, but they can find those people. Whereas if you're like the one conservative at Pomona College, you might be out of luck.
Okay. Anything else? No? All right. I was curious about the rankings and the 14 components that you used. You talked about the traffic light system that you have, but you didn't really dive into these 14 components. Can we do that now?
Sure.
Okay.
So Angela hinted at some of them earlier in this discussion. So from the survey, we calculate a score on how comfortable students are expressing their ideas on controversial political topics. And we ask about 5 different settings on campus. So we ask about in the classroom, we ask about when they're talking with their professors, we ask about talking with peers, just in a common space. So that's one of the components. We have a couple tolerance components that draw on the political science literature, where we ask about different liberal and conservative speakers who have said something controversial, and we ask students if they should be allowed or not allowed on campus. So we calculate a tolerance for liberal speakers score, tolerance for conservative speakers. Those actually don't go into the calculation. What does is we put the average tolerance in, and then depending on how, then schools lose points for having a big difference. So if they heavily favor liberal speakers over conservative ones or vice versa, they'll lose points. We have a component that looks at the acceptability of what we call a liberal protest or deviant conduct. So we ask students how acceptable it is to shout speakers down, to physically block students from entering events, or to use violence to stop a speech. We mentioned that we have questions about the administration, so we call that the administrative support component. So we ask students how likely it is the administration will defend speech, and how clear it is that they support the First Amendment. And I mentioned earlier we ask about the political topics students find difficult to discuss openly and honestly, so we call that the openness component. So those are the survey-based components, and then we bring in how universities resolved speech controversies on campus through the aforementioned 3 databases. And if a speaker getting shouted down, a tenured professor getting fired, a student getting expelled, these carry very heavy penalties. Penalties are lighter for when a professor or student is placed under investigation, or a speaking event is postponed but ultimately rescheduled. So we have kind of a tiered system where the kind of most severe things that we think have the most chilling effects cause the most damage to a school, and they stick for a while. They decay over time, but they stick for a while. And then more minor things, they still get a ding, but those will disappear more quickly.
And there's a lot of interesting data in there this year. So among the topics that are difficult to have an open and honest conversation about, we've asked about Israel-Palestine every year. This year, it's the highest, as you might expect. 55% of students feel uncomfortable having an open and honest conversation about it. The highest of any topic in any year that we've surveyed. On some campuses, it's upwards of 80% of students?
There's somewhere, so there's a handful over 70, and then there's, some that are even over 80% of students saying this, yeah.
And this is in an environment where we want to have students grappling with difficult concepts, difficult ideas, difficult issues. And so it's really highlighting this sort of larger problem that's going on campus. I think another one worth noting is the liberal protest tactics. How has that changed over time?
Students are finding all of them more acceptable.
Yeah, and
at this point.
What is it? It's like so. Using violence to stop a speaker on campus, is that?
It's gone from about around 20% of students saying always, sometimes, or rarely acceptable, to about a third now.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's happy.
Yeah, and we've been seeing a lot of shout-downs this past year as well.
Yeah, we also, over the spring, we ran a second survey late in spring, just specifically about the encampments. And we ran it on 3 pockets of schools: schools that had encampments, schools that had encampments and arrests, and schools without either. And one of the things I thought was notable is the rise of students who felt unsafe on campus, especially on campuses that had arrests and encampments. Mm-hmm. I think that's sort of all related to each other.
This is an organized thing. It's not just random students. There are organizations, who are pushing suppression of free speech because of moral reasons. And I want to get into that. This isn't just pure, I don't want to hear what you're talking about. There is a moral duty that a lot of these students feel to shout down these people, to deplatform these people. A good person deplatforms that person, right? So how do we deal with this moral component to it. It's not just about, letters in the Constitution. It's about, your heart and your mind.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I know I've said training a lot, training, but really schools should be doing what they do best, and that's education. And so they should be from day one talking to students about the value of hearing people you firmly disagree with, and how that helps refine your own arguments, and how it just is helpful to know if there are people that have such horrible, wrong-headed views in this world, so that you can engage with them and defeat them. And so hitting that message hard with students from when they get to campus and throughout their education is, I think, the only way.
It's the idea, I'd rather know who my enemy is, so let them speak.
Yes.
I think you also need to make the attempt to convey that not every incident or speaker who said something is like an existential battle that needs to be fought. I think that it sounds like that's been conveyed in a lot of ways to students and these student organizations who make arguments like, oh, well, a good person deplatforms this person because we just can't allow that. We just can't allow this at all. And I think, getting a better understanding of how other people think about morality, because there are differences. I'll give a shout out to my good friend and old mentor, Jonathan Haidt, but I think his moral foundations theory provides a good way of, I know for me, that provided a good way of understanding people on the other side of my politics and understanding why they're concerned about what they're concerned about, and then it humanizes them, and I don't know, you just don't get as mad about it.
Yeah, that's the righteous mind, right?
Yeah.
Yes, pick that up. It's pretty good. So I was reading a Teagle report the other day about, modes of education, approaches to education. And, you have content knowledge as an outcome. You have inquiry as an outcome, modes of methodologies, things like that. And then there's values and dispositions. And what's meant there is that we're trying to make these students into a certain kind of person, perhaps a kind of person that can tolerate free speech because, well, he or she also has that right? So is this about trying to shape students into certain kinds of people? Is that the best way to go about this?
There's definitely value in that base level civic education, right? Like, one of the reasons free speech is really important, and you can engage in all sorts of different ways, but the strongest way to understand another person is to understand how to have a dialogue with them. And if
Right.
you're not being taught that in your education because you are shouting down a speaker instead, you're going to create these barriers and silos that only rip apart the country more.
Right.
I think it's not necessarily about creating a certain type of person per se, but it's, and Angela's hinting at it, it's like creating a citizen or an adult who can interact and live in a pluralistic society.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is about, opening your ideas up to scrutiny, right? The marketplace of ideas, as they say. But some people say that marketplace of ideas is a myth. It's not really a thing. It seems like that sentiment has taken over on college campuses. There's no marketplace of ideas. It's just power. And in order to deal with power, we have to do what we have to do. The ends justify the means. This is not a question. This is just me talking. Okay? I need to get this off my chest. I do have a question for you, and this is something that I'm actually afraid to ask, but I will ask it anyway. I wrote it down to get it right. Based on recent studies, there is a strong correlation between schools with rising free speech intolerance and anti-Semitism and schools that receive funding from hostile foreign entities like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Is there truth to this, and what's going on?
So you're referencing a recent paper that actually uses some of FIRE's data in it, and myself and one of our research fellows, Nate Honeycutt, are co-authors on this. We basically just wrote up the FIRE section. But this paper found that it looks at foreign funding that flows into universities, and it's very hard to trace because effectively it's dark money. It's coming, the universities don't necessarily have to report where it's coming from, so it's complicated in terms of how to find it and actually link it back. I don't think we have time to go into that. But schools that received the most funding had the most deplatforming attempts, had the most scholars under fire. We looked at it a little bit. This didn't make it into the paper, but we also looked at it alongside some of our survey data, and it's like they're some of the worst performing schools in the rankings. There's a lot more to this. There's a lot more to it than just correlating this stuff with the fire data.
Sure.
But yeah, that's what we can see so far, and I think it's been replicated. The first paper was on Middle Eastern dark money, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. There was a more recent report put out by the same group that didn't involve Nate and I, but it was about China.
All right. Is there anything being done about this?
I know that there's been some talk in the House, and perhaps with the Republicans taking more power, I think they are currently the party more maybe motivated to take this on, so we might see something happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
I really hope so, because that's something that a lot of people don't know about, I think.
I would also say, though, I would be concerned that they might go too heavy-handed. I mean, right now you have a lot of people, Republicans in the House, pushing schools on Title VI investigations, anti-Semitism, and I think there's a danger there in them maybe going over the line, too.
Okay. All right. This is happy stuff, isn't it? I want to remind people that we will be taking questions today. The people online, please submit your questions to our Cato website, the Facebook account, the X account, using hashtag Cato Events. I want to get into some questions now. So let's start with in-house. Does anybody have a question? Yes, sir. It's coming, sorry. I didn't give them a chance to set up the microphone and all that stuff. That's on me.
Down here in the front.
Down here.
Hi, Mark Lerner. So if a campus like GW closed out their, the protests, they cleaned out the squatters, what happened to their ranking?
So on that, we made the decision in terms of the encampment protests themselves, because as we mentioned before, that it's kind of administrators were dealing with a pretty difficult situation where there's some unprotected speech, prone to time, place, manner restrictions, and maybe some other reasons why it would be unprotected, but then a lot of it maybe was. So we effectively decided not to punish schools for directly how they handled the encampments. But as I mentioned, it shows up in the survey responses where students were unhappy with the schools. You'll see it in not just the administrative scores, but a few other variables as well.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Joe Freeman. I'm an alumnus of the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. Where is Berkeley in your rankings? That's question number one. And perhaps I should say why, since it obviously is not in the top 10. And secondly, Berkeley and UCLA chancellors handled the encampments very differently. I'd appreciate any comment you might have on that and what it has to say about free speech.
First of all, thank you for being part of that free speech movement. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so Berkeley is they're not at the bottom with like Harvard and UPenn, but they don't do great. I can say that they're one of the schools that has reached out to us recently, and it was high-level administrators, and they do want things to change. They admitted they have a problem. They're kind of like, we knew it. We did a survey ourselves after the Milo incident, and what we found in those results really troubled us in terms of what the student body thinks and even some of the faculty. But there is efforts going on at Berkeley in terms of like the higher level administrators working, like Laura's been directly in touch with them as well. So I think there's hope there that they'll improve. They're in like the 200s somewhere, out of 251, like in the 220s somewhere right now. No, that's pretty low.
Pretty low.
Yeah, no, they're more
quarter.
towards, they're probably in the bottom quarter.
Well, and the
Yeah.
nice thing about all of the survey component data is that we've made it all available online. And so I don't know exactly what survey components they scored poorly on, but all of those results are available. And so you can see exactly, all right, they were low on administrative support for free speech, or they were low for students' comfort expressing ideas. And it's been helpful when I've worked with administrators, because then we can zero in on exactly what is the problem and what types of reforms we should adopt. So if it's administrative support for free speech, okay, let's get the administration putting out positive free speech statements to the students regularly. Or if it is about comfort expressing ideas, let's have a civil dialogue workshop and talk about talking across difference. And so all of that is available for each school online.
UCLA also, it doesn't do that well. I think they're ranked in a they're close to each other in the rankings. I don't remember exactly where UCLA is, but they also don't do very well. Both schools have had a number of like the speech controversies that we've mentioned that they incur penalties for. I would not be surprised to see UCLA drop below Berkeley in next year's rankings, given how they've handled things with the encampments.
Let's take some questions from online here. Anonymous asked, what are the implications, if any, for freedom of expression of President-elect Trump's recent ultimatum saying he will strip accreditation from universities that fail to do more to combat anti-Semitism on campus?
Well, anti-Semitic speech can sometimes be protected. And so when we use a broad term like anti-Semitism, that brings up immediate concerns for me. I mean, it remains to be seen how this would actually be implemented, so sort of have to wait and see on that. But anti-Semitic speech, again, without constituting a true threat or harassment or discrimination, can be protected. And Sean brought it up earlier with Title VI investigations. I think schools are under a lot of pressure right now to take action against protected speech. Because we have University of Michigan, for example, who was successfully sued over their bias reporting policy because they found it to infringe on First Amendment rights. But then a few years later, they're hit with this Title VI investigation for not taking action against every type of reported speech. And so I think that administrators are in a bit of a difficult position because of that.
But in some ways, they've put themselves there in a lot of ways because they have not been consistent in how they adjudicate these policies. So I wouldn't let them off the hook entirely. Even though it has been a difficult year for them, I certainly wouldn't want to let them off the hook.
Yes, I'm glad you said that, not me. I keep trashing academia. I need to stop doing that, so thank you for trashing academia just now. I have another question, and this is an interesting one. Has there been a rise in university policies compelling use of preferred pronouns? Right. So there's an issue with the First Amendment that you can't prescribe certain things. Right. You can't make somebody say something. Right. How do the pronouns fit into this whole thing, if at all?
So from our review of policies, and we have 489 schools in our database right now, it's pretty rare to see a policy that requires pronoun use. Okay. I think we've only seen about one or two from all the schools in the country. However, you do see a lot of guidelines and those sorts of documents that are sent out to students that encourage them to use a student's preferred pronoun or chosen name. And so when you have those sorts of guidelines being sent out, that can certainly send the message that that's the only way that students are able to interact with each other, and that can have a chilling effect.
I would also mention the diversity, equity, and inclusion statements that universities are starting to require for employment, on faculty applications, and also tenure review promotion. And those can be a form of compelled speech as well. And we mentioned we have a faculty survey coming out soon. Faculty are pretty split on this. About half of them don't think they're appropriate at all. The other half are like, yeah, they can be okay at times. So this is not a settled issue in academia at all.
Okay. Well, at least they can have those conversations,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there are a lot of people who say certain topics shouldn't be discussed at all because of the quote-unquote harm it can do to other people. So if we can get past the violence, words or violence thing, then perhaps we're on our way. But let me put this away right now and ask some questions of the audience. Yes? His hand's been up for a while.
JP Hogan. Recently in DC, I've come across, they just did a book launch for a handbook of illiberalism. So I'm wondering in the scoring, first, there's this sort of primary question is, for the top 20, what is the common denominator maybe between the schools that are scoring well? But are they not using the term illiberalism? But this book is like a 1,000-page book that different people wrote as a liberal about what illiberalism is. And I'm just wondering, it seems to fit into where the free speech is degrading.
So there's a couple commonalities. Most of the schools in the top 20, 25 or so have the green light policy rating. So they have clear speech policies. The ones that are ranked usually fairly highly in in the top 10 or even in the top 5, I mentioned Michigan Tech before, but UVA, Florida State, they've also stood up for free expression during controversies. We actually saw some data presented at our faculty conference a few weeks ago that further supports this notion we've had that when you kind of nip the controversy early and say no and stand up to the protesters and stand up to their demands, it's like it signals that you're not going to stand for this, and then the controversies don't happen as often. And we saw some data presented at our conference where if a controversy does happen, you need to issue a response, and that will mitigate any kind of loss in confidence or et cetera that people have in the university setting. So strong statements supporting speech, most of these schools have made those. They tend to have good administrative support scores. They tend to have lower self-censorship scores, and the students report greater comfort expressing their views on controversial political opinions.
Well, and I think a common theme with all of those examples would be clarity, and students know what to expect from the institution. So maybe they disagree with the school's choice, but at least they know it's coming, and they know to expect that.
I think the clarity is an important point, because if you actually look at the bottom schools, most of them are yellow light schools, not red light schools. And as Laura mentioned earlier, well, the red light is clearly worse, but it's also a clear threat to speech, so the students might know that. Whereas when it's a yellow light policy and it's vaguely worded, they don't know when they're going to be applied and when they won't be.
Well, and even green light school and top of the rankings UVA had an incident last year where it had a ban on encampments on the books, but then there was another guidance document that said that you could have a tent set up if you got permission for it, and so completely conflicting restrictions. And so the night before an encampment was to take place, they took down the one that said that you could have encampments and said, oh no, it's been our policy the whole time that encampments were banned, but that caused some issues because students were reasonably confused by that.
Okay. I think your hand was up, and then, yes. Blue shirt, sweater? Oh. Yes, you. Okay.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about administrative bloat in universities, and a lot of these administrators, like according to Yasha Monk in his book, The Identity Trap, are the ideologues, for the identitarian ideologues. And I'm just sort of wondering what faculty think of this, because when administration expands, that's taking power away from the academic senate, and what do they think? So are you reaching out to faculty about their opinions on this? And those are the ones who are reviewing the DEI statements too, these people in administration, and they have veto power first before it ever gets to the departments, So.
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing a lot of concern about shared governance being trampled in the past year, where colleges are making changes to policies, particularly with regard to protest, because of all the protests that happened in the past year. And so I have personally been hearing from faculty members who have said, you know, they pushed this policy through, it's unconstitutional, they didn't consult with faculty in the way that they were supposed to, and then I come in and try to work with them to improve that. But as far as other faculty data, I mean, do you have a sense of that, Sean?
Well, yeah, so I would actually say as someone like Eric who left academia too, I think for a while there, faculty were like okay with maybe ceding some of these responsibilities to administrators. This is going back to like the 80s, because it's like, oh, well, this frees me up to do, I can focus on my research and I can focus on my teaching and I don't have to do this, that, or the other thing anymore. Fast forward to today, and I think we have from our faculty survey data and some prior research we've done, you've got a lot of faculty, like Laura says, like not happy about this. And I think perhaps the events of the past year and, you know, things like, oh, Harvard, and what they've done to faculty the last month or so who are protesting silently in the library, and they've suspended like 25 of them. And then there was another one this week. We'll see what happens to those faculty, but I think the events of the past year have maybe woken a lot of faculty up in the same way that it's woken up the liberal progressive students on campus. And so maybe a little hopeful instead of so negative.
Can we get the mic over here?
Hi. So you've spoken a lot about the university administrations and presidents, but you haven't spoken about the elephant in the room, the U.S. Congress, as much. And what we saw in the last year was incredibly extraordinary, almost like McCarthy types of hearings relating to anti-Semitism. My grandfather was a refugee from Germany. His parents were murdered in Auschwitz. I'm extremely concerned that any kind of criticism of Israel immediately gets labeled as anti-Semitism and it's game over. So, and also my community shuns me from having divergent views about this particular issue. So I guess, you know, how are we going to deal with this on a political perspective? It seems quite bipartisan that all of the Congress people and the senators are, you know, coming down against anti-Semitism, and they're unwilling to uphold values of free speech. And then you see a bigger problem. There are law firms and companies that are trolling social media of students and basically saying if they criticize Israel, there's no jobs for them. So thank you.
Sure. I mean, Sean mentioned this earlier that, you know, unfortunately, when the presidents got to those hearings, it was kind of already over as far as they didn't have a principled background of defending free speech to stand on when they were asked, is this sort of speech harassment? Because they had the right answer to that question. The answer is it does depend on the context and what exactly is happening in each case. It's highly fact specific. But because they had been hypocritical on that point in the past, that's what was an issue there. And so I think that what universities need to do moving forward is to be consistent on these issues, whether it is about anti-Semitism or if it's anti-Black speech, anti-gay speech, and whatever it may be, because I think Americans were perceiving that this anti-Semitic speech is the only speech where it gets the "it depends" answer, and that's where the problem came up.
Okay. I do want to ask a question, one more question from our online audience. This comes from Matt Malkin, and he asked, do you have evidence that students fear getting low grades if they express disagreement with the political opinions of the instructor?
We specifically asked about that.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
We do. We asked about that last year as it's not a question that factored into the rankings calculation, but we've always, this goes back to an earlier question about who is the rankings for, and we got off that topic. But it is for researchers too. The survey was always built as like a version of the general social survey, but for college students. So we have our core questions that feed into the rankings, but we also rotate a handful of questions in every year. So we did ask about this year. Yes, we found evidence that more, as you get more moderate to conservative, those students are more fearful of this. But I will point out, on the flip side, it's a very difficult topic to study, but the few empirical studies done that have tried to look at this don't find evidence that really a lot of, many, if any, professors are actually downgrading students because of their politics. But I would say it's still a problem if students think they are. Like, it's still a psychological reality for the students, so that's still a problem. And we're going to be asking that question again this year, so.
Well, I have a kind of inverted version of that question. Are faculty afraid of students?
I think so. I think a lot of them rightfully are. And then to keep talking about some of that literature, some of the older studies that looked at that basically found that when students infer that their professors' politics are different from theirs, they give them lower ratings on the teacher evaluations.
Right.
There's a recent study, I can't remember who it was by, it was not us, asking students if they think it's okay to report a faculty for something that they said, and it's like 70% think it's okay.
Yeah.
Well, and just anecdotally, I've heard things about, law professors worrying about teaching sexual assault in criminal law classes, and so you hear that they just don't want to take the risk of that showing up in the evaluation.
Yeah. A lot of this is about, disposition, and character of faculty, students, and things like that. What can you tolerate? What can't you tolerate? It's about grit when it comes down to it, to a large extent, resilience, grit, things like that. Things that are hard to teach in a class Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 12:30 or something like that. Ideally, it's something that is instilled before that, or doing it in some kind of extracurricular way. But we may have to focus and embrace that idea a little bit more and get accused of indoctrination. But that's for later. Let's ask some questions here. Yes?
Thank you. I've got a real question, then I've got a minor question. The minor question is, where do we find the data on your website? What is the website? But my real question is, and I'm not sure if this relates to free speech directly. If you look at all the violence that's taken place on the campuses this last year, a lot of this was enabled by the fact that people were able to immerse themselves in, cover everything but their eyes. In other words, they weren't wearing COVID masks, they were totally masked, which enables a great deal of boldness from a group that is normally used to sending out messages on social media. If you passed rules eliminating that on campuses in such protests, would that be considered a free speech issue? And then the website question.
So I can jump in about the regulation of masks question. It's a tough one because statutes that ban wearing a mask to commit a crime or to conceal your identity while you're committing misconduct, those are typically upheld, whereas broad bans on masks are not, because there is this right to anonymous speech that is foundational to First Amendment rights. When you think about the Federalist Papers or Common Sense, that sort of pseudonymous publication is kind of why we have a First Amendment. And so when I've been advising schools about this question, I've been giving them the advice that they should adopt something that's narrow and that goes to people who are actually wearing that mask in order to commit misconduct.
And then so our website is just thefire.org, and you could find the rankings through there. But you could also go to rankings.thefire.org, and that'll bring you directly to the college free speech rankings. It'll show you, have schools 1 through 251, and then if you want to see the individual data for each school, there's in the upper right-hand corner on that page, there's Explore the Data Further, and that'll bring you to the crosstabs for each school by question. We've also put out a good number of specialized reports on individual schools that you could find on our website.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and that's going to be a question from me. because I'm the moderator. I can do that. Actually, it is from online, but I also have this question. How has the University of Chicago dropped so far this year, given that they came up with the Chicago principles that are widely touted as the standard for institutional free speech policies? 30 seconds.
So the University of Chicago, for the first 3 years that we did this, was the top-ranked school. It was number 1, 2 of the 3 years. It was number 2 the other year. Last year, in the 2024 rankings, they dropped to 13th for denying recognition to a student organization. It was Turning Point USA. They were told they were too similar to another group already on campus. So that was last year. This year, there were multiple shout-downs of speakers that occurred after October 7th. One of them they mitigated the damage on because the president made a very good statement, but there still was a penalty because we considered the shout-downs to be very severe. But the other one, the administration really didn't say anything about it. So those are the reasons why.
Okay, well, I think that's it for today. Thank you, Angela, Laura, Sean, for coming and talking to us about the 2025 free speech rankings. Hopefully things improve for 2026. My fingers are crossed. Perhaps we're heading in the right direction. I want to commend you for providing this information. It's very valuable. It's information that many people need, students as well as their parents, as well as administrators, as well as people who want to be professors one day. You know, this is very good information. I can't thank you enough. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that. So thank you very much. Here.